Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Ciara Greene, who is a professor of psychology at University College Dublin, and also the co-author of this book here called Memory Lane, The Perfectly Imperfect Ways We Remember. Welcome, Ciara.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I think, in this book, you want us all to rethink how we think about memory, right? And I think all of us have this idea that the best kind of memory is one that is photographic, right? that records as much information as possible on the way in and then stores it with as much fidelity as possible. And I think you make the point, maybe you are channeling Borges, right? But say that this would not actually be a good or desirable or evolutionarily desirable type of memory, right? And if we rethink about the function of memory, what it's supposed to do, then not only are we going to have sort of a imperfect uptake, but we're also going to have kind of imperfect recall, right? And this is for a reason. This is a feature and not a bug, I guess, to use the language of Silicon Valley. And so I guess the question is, why is it that we have, it seems like we've had this vision of what constitutes good in the world of memory since long before we had photographs and long before we had hard drives to store our data. So, why is it that we have this view of memory which fails to acknowledge trade-offs?
Well, look, we, like with a lot of things, we do tend to think of accuracy as being the highest motive. And, when we criticize each other for getting things wrong, we criticize ourselves because our memories aren't perfectly faithful representations of the real world. But our argument is, that we shouldn't expect that of ourselves. We're not computers, we're not recording devices, and we shouldn't think of ourselves as though we are. And the computer metaphor is obviously a fairly new one, but we've always used kind of technological metaphors to describe our memory, whatever the technology of the day is, or just describe our minds generally. Like Freud was really influenced by, hydraulics, by steam engines, and by, kind of electric, hydroelectric dams, this idea of storing off energy and then it being released, So whatever the current technology is that everybody thinks is new and cool, we're always going to use that as a metaphor to describe ourselves in some ways. And, so we see that through history with memory, people using different metaphors, people used to talk in the 1920s, the behaviorists talked about memory as though it was like a switchboard, where you kind of plug into a particular area. And that's how you get your memory. You just plug into a different socket. And then with the computer age, and really the rise of cognitive psychology aligns with the rise of the computer age and kind of through the 1960s, really. And we get this idea of kind of information processing, that we're taking in information, that we're encoding, even just that terminology that we use for memory, where we say that we encode a memory, that's language coming from computers, that we're encoding a memory, we're taking in information, we're performing some kind of operations on that information in our minds, and then we're outputting it in some way in behavior, in some kind of output. So it's a very computer metaphor. But our memories are much more organic than that, and they evolved. So, when we think about all these metaphors, what we would say is it's important to think, not just about what memory is, it's not something static, but to think about what it's for, what its function is, and how it evolved in the way that it did. Because just like every other part of our minds and our bodies, every function that we have evolved under evolutionary pressures, that there are survival pressures and reproduction pressures, and those influence the way in which we evolved as human beings, as any kind of species. So when we think about our memory, I think it's important to keep that in mind, and that evolution wasn't prioritizing, it's super important that you remember absolutely every boring detail of every single experience you've ever had, and that you have this perfect fidelity and recollection of every detail of everything you observe. That's not necessary to support your survival. It's not necessary to support reproduction, and in some cases it can be counterproductive.
Well, you of course use metaphor as well, and your metaphor is of the Lego brick tower, right?
Yeah.
And, you talk about memory as continuous reconstruction. So this tower is not only being added to, but subtracted from, right, over time. And in
Yeah.
fact, every time you recall something, you are kind of rewriting the story in some way, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, this idea of reconstruction is not new, and this isn't our idea. The Lego Tower, is our metaphor, but this idea of reconstruction is definitely not something we just came up with. We know that this is how memory works, that memory is reconstructive. So that when we remember something, it often feels like we're retrieving a memory fully formed. Like it often feels like you're, you know, opening up a filing cabinet if you're going in a non-tech direction, or you're going into your hard drive and retrieving a file. But it's not the way it is. It's not this kind of solid piece of information, this static information that's just filed somewhere, and all you have to do is, the only problem is access. Actually, when we remember something, we're actively creating the memory. We're reconstructing it, rebuilding it from its component parts. Um, and we do that, and that kind of produces a lot of particular kind of systematic. I don't want to say errors, but it produces some systematic structures in the way that we tend to remember. So, to kind of to really hammer home this kind of Lego tower metaphor, we would say, when we go to remember something, a lot of the time we have a kind of a mental blueprint of what that tower should look like. So some of your listeners might be familiar with the idea of schemas. So schemas are these kind of structures that we have in long-term memory that help us to file away information, to help us to recognize commonalities across kind of events that we experience, to kind of have an expectation of like, well, every time I go to the doctor, this is the setup of what typically happens, so it's not all a total shock every time. And we use those frameworks, those schemas as blueprints to help us construct these towers every time we retrieve memory. And it's very efficient. We're not, really mixing my metaphors here, but we're not reinventing the wheel every time. We're not building that tower from scratch. We're not going, God, I wonder how I might go about building a tower. You already know what this tower should look like, and then we use that as a template to build that new one. So we use these pre-existing structures that we have developed over our lifetime. Like my schema is going to be different to your schema. It's going to be dependent on the particular experiences that you've had, both your individual experiences but also cultural experiences. Those are going to shape what that blueprint looks like. Just like a building might look different if it was built in Dubai and if it was built in Dublin. The different ecological constraints are going to change the way that building is going to look. And similarly, my mental blueprint for the events of my lives will be different to yours.
Yeah, but I mean, I think about in the world of behavioral economics, right? There's this view that, okay, fine, compute is expensive. And so given that compute is expensive, we have to try to do our best with, as much, as whatever compute we can afford. And I think there's a parallel view, which would be with memory. Yeah, we'd love to have perfect memory, but storage is expensive.
So it's not storage. It's so if you want to stick with the computer memory, it's not hard drive storage, it's RAM.
Yeah.
It's processing capacity that's limited.
On the way, yeah, but I think you're making an even more ambitious claim, which is it's not just that our memories are limited because of storage costs, but you're saying even if storage cost was cheaper, we would still want to organize our memories and encode them in a way which is not 100% faithful to the world, right?
We think so, yeah. Now, some of this is speculative. Some of it is based on a lot of research. Some of it is work that we're planning on doing. But yeah, based on what we know so far, that seems to be the case, that as with anything else, so there's never only one reason, right? So when something evolves, it's because it was beneficial and it wasn't exceptionally harmful. So there were no enormous downsides to it. And typically it was more beneficial than the alternatives available. Okay. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the one absolute best perfect route to whatever the function you're looking for is, because evolution doesn't have foresight. It can't plan ahead and say, well, the absolute best possible way to achieve this goal in the future would be to go down this route versus that route. It can't possibly know that. It can compare options available at the time, and essentially selection pressures will determine that of the options that are currently available, the one that results in the most survival and the most reproduction, that's the option that will thrive. So we know those pressures operate, and we know that they affect the development of our brain just the same as they affect the development of our hands and our arms and our hearts and everything else. So, it's not, there's nothing new in saying that, evolutionary pressures influence our minds. But we're trying to kind of just really specifically apply this in the context of memory. So, this has there's a couple of different ways we can look at this, and we can look at essentially the benefits of having what we might think of as a more flawed or less perfect memory, and what the upsides of those are. And there's quite a few of them. So one of them is whether it's actually beneficial to remember everything. Is that actually useful, or is it a more efficient way? Is it more efficient to kind of not remember everything? And one way we can look at this is we can think about people who actually do have really, really good memories. So we can look at people who have this condition called highly superior autobiographical memory, which is a real mouthful. So it usually gets abbreviated to HSAM. There's sometimes called hyperthymesia as well, but that doesn't really get used much anymore. But these are people
and I think
who have
most people, if you said to most people, would you like to have this disorder? They'd be like, that'd be great. I could remember where my keys are.
It's not a disorder. It's a lot of people who do have it would say, oh, it's great, but some don't. It's not a disorder. It's a kind of a neural difference. But a lot of people will say, "Oh, that sounds amazing. I'd never forget anything." Yeah, I just say, I'd never lose my keys. I'd never forget someone's birthday. I'd never, piss off my partner because I just didn't listen to the conversation that we had and I don't remember what we were talking about. So, this sounds amazing, but actually it has a lot of downsides. So there are people who, talked about this. So probably the most famous person with this condition is a woman called Jill Price, and she wrote a book about this, and she's talked about it a lot. And she talks a lot about how actually this kind of, the way I think about this is not sometimes just an ability to remember everything, but it's actually nearly an inability to forget. And that if you remember like absolutely every detail of your life, then you have emotionally, this can create problems because you can't move on. So we often use these terms, like we say, time is a great healer. But only the reason time is a great healer is because over time we start to forget about more negative aspects of our lives. And there's lots of experimental evidence for this, that as time goes on the whole, we tend to remember positive features of our lives and our memories, and we tend to forget the negative ones. They're not always. Obviously, there are lots of exceptions and there are traumatic experiences. But on average, we tend to remember the positive more than the negative. So that's one thing. If you can't do that, if you can't kind of forget those events, then those negative things, those painful events are just as vivid in your memory years later as they were the day they happened. So you'll never move past an argument you had with your spouse. You'll never get over the breakup you had when you were 16. You'll never get over the death of somebody you loved, because that pain won't fade with time. And Jill talks about never being able to get over an argument with somebody because you're always so insistent that you were right, because you remember every detail and it's all so, so vivid, and it's just as annoying as it was when you actually had this argument. So, not being able to kind of move on, there's a kind of mental health things. But there's also kind of a more cognitive aspect to this as well, which is what we refer to as kind of mental digestion. So a lot of the experiences in our lives, we like to think of our lives as being, we're all special snowflakes and everything is individual. But actually, a lot of the experiences of our lives are very repetitive, and like every morning you get up, you have breakfast, you get dressed, you brush your teeth, you do other things in the bathroom, you get in the car, you drive to work. It's all very boring, and most of the time you don't need to record this completely faithful, veridical, detailed recollection of every aspect of that. You don't need a high resolution memory of every bite of cornflakes you've ever put in your mouth and how crunchy or how soggy they were, and how many bites it took you to get through the bowl, and like what temperature was the milk. You don't need that level of information. Okay, what you need to extract from that is the gist that most mornings you eat cornflakes. Okay, so that's that ability to, it's not just, as you say, a matter of kind of processing. It's also that ability to extract gist is really important. That's what allows us to learn. It's what allows us to recognize the commonality across our experiences, and to understand what's normal, and then to recognize deviations from normality within our own lives. And to recognize what we like. That this is part of how we build those schemas. That we build those schemas by extracting gist, by recognizing the commonality across multiple slightly different experiences. So that's, you go to the doctor, and every time you go to the doctor, it's not exactly the same, but there's an awful lot of commonalities among them. And by extracting the gist across those experiences, you're able to have a script for what to expect. You know what's going to happen when you go in. You know what's what's going to come next. You know how to plan for it. All of those kinds of things. So if we're not able to do that, if we're not able to forget everything, if we just see everything at the same high level detail, then we can't boil it down. We can't digest those things mentally and extract what's important and discard what isn't.
Yeah, I mean, so this part I really liked. I'm glad you brought up the term gist. I mean, I mean, I don't, tell me if this is incorrect, but it's not explicitly spelled out. But I get the sense that the reason why we have memory in the first place is just for decision making, right? Going forward. And evolution doesn't care about your past. It only cares about your future and wants you to make good decisions going forward. And so I saw a lot of analogies between this and what we talk about in machine learning, which is, finding the optimal amount of specificity in one's predictions, right? And if you try to incorporate all of the data, then you're going to overfit, right?
Exactly.
And so you want to
your model. It's too specific. Yeah. It won't generalize. Yeah.
Right. And so that's kind of what gist extraction is. It's kind of coming up with a model that is sufficiently general that will help you, move forward in potentially new environments.
Yes, exactly. And that is a lot of what our memory is about. Is, if you think about it again from that purely kind of survival focus. Now, there's lots of things that we evolved that aren't, necessarily like driving things forward, but they had to have survived those evolutionary pressures. Okay, so they have to have been not actively harmful, typically. The things that tend to be actively harmful tend to be, to be selected against. But so it's like there's this kind of idea of that what we're really trying to what's being selected for is aspects of memory that will support us to make sensible decisions, will support us to improve our survival and reproductive chance. And we can think of this kind of more broadly. Like there are lots of things that support our survival and our health. And those even include things like better mental health. We know that better mental health is associated with longer survival, higher reproduction, all kinds of things, so there is a lot of links with those. There's all that kind of stuff. There's also another really key part that we think is potentially really important is social cohesion. So, humans are social animals. We don't live in isolation. We live with other people, and all the evidence shows from not just from humans, but across species, that living in societies, living in groups is really, really essential to survival. That animals that are isolated from the group don't survive. Okay, and so social cohesion is something that is therefore of really important, really high importance to it from an evolutionary perspective. You need to be integrated into your group. You need to be part of your group. You need to have the protection of a group. And then to support that comes with all kinds of, it's this whole kind of psychological baggage that comes along with that. All this kind of, essentially all of social psychology derives from this. So everything we know about like in-group and out-group effects, and how we tend to treat people who look like us and speak like us and think like us, and how we tend to think of those people versus people who look differently or speak differently, and those effects are very, very powerful. And we see those happening in memory as well. So that we see that the way people tend to reconstruct memories tends to be in ways that will support their kind of affiliation with their group and their sense of social cohesion with their group. Go ahead.
Yeah, but well, I mean, if we care about decision making, then it doesn't really matter if we learn something from direct experience or from someone else's experience. Yeah. And so some of my favorite examples included situations where people confuse having experienced something themselves and having read about it,
Yeah.
I remember one of my favorite examples is, I will go and see something. I'll go see the National Theater in the movie screen. And when I'm remembering it, I remember it being in the theater, because it's sort of an inessential detail, right? And serves the same purpose.
Confusion. You forget where you forget where you have the information, but like when we, unlike a computer, I suppose, when memories are stored in our brains, they're not stored with a tag saying this was recorded in this location. Like it doesn't have metadata, so it's not recorded.
No footnotes.
No. So we have to actually infer that. It's called it's called source monitoring. It's a kind of a big model. Like we have to infer the source of that information, and we infer it in a few different ways. memories. There's basically two ways we do it. So we're getting really into the weeds theoretically now. So stop me if this is it's too totally boring. But um, so basically, there's two ways we do that. Like one is we have this kind of like two parallel systems. We have one that's kind of a heuristic based system that's based on things like, does this seem like something that's a memory? Where does this feel like this came from? And this is like, say, things like you have an experience and, something you're kind of, standing in the shower going, did that happen or did I dream it? Do you ever have this
Right,
wake up
right.
and you're like, did this thing happen or did I dream it?
I've
And
had, I've
then,
had people get angry at me because they had a
yeah.
dream about me.
And then like sometimes over the course of your shower, you figure out that it was a dream. And like, how did you do that? And some of it is kind of heuristic stuff. Like you're like, it seemed very fuzzy. It didn't have the kind of perceptual characteristics of a real memory. It felt fuzzy, or there were some aspects of it that just didn't feel right. And then the other is kind of a more systematic approach where you're going, well, okay, I was having a conversation with so-and-so, but actually that person is in Australia, so they can't possibly have had a real conversation with them. Or I don't remember how I got to that location or how I got back, so it must not have been real. So you're kind of thinking in a very logical way. And those two processes happen simultaneously, and you use them to infer the source of mental experiences. So was this a memory? Was this something I dreamed? Was it something I imagined? Was it something someone else told me? And that includes things like you have a memory of, say, you're watching I don't know, you're watching a play from London of Richard III, and then later on that you remember you're actually sitting in the theatre in London watching this,
Right.
and but like it's because your memory is of the events on stage, and then you kind of infer from that like it was in a theatre, and then you're reconstructing that memory based on all the experiences you previously had of sitting in the theatre and what that is like, and you're kind of essentially pulling those bricks together to construct that tower.
Yeah, you didn't tell the story, but I remember Ronald Reagan one time confused a movie that I think he had acted in, and some story about some war hero, and he
Yeah.
got up in front of public, gave a speech about this war hero who never existed. It was in a
Yeah.
movie,
And
right?
it's really embarrassing. And the thing is that when these things happen, in the book, we give a couple of examples of, Hillary Clinton remembering being under fire in Sarajevo and it didn't happen, and, things like this. And it's really embarrassing when these things happen. And because these people are politicians, we tend to hold them to this very high standard. And we tend to kind of assume that, if they tell us something that isn't correct, that it was intentional and that it was a lie. But it would be a really stupid lie when it's so easy to detect it and so easy to recognize. So, like nobody who's actually trying to pull one over on you would hope that you wouldn't recognize they wouldn't recognize the film or whatever it is. So instead, it's a memory error. It's a memory confusion. And then, like, this happens in much more serious cases as well. Like one of the stories we tell in the book is of a man who was who was accused of rape, of sexual assault. And it was this horrible story of a woman who was assaulted by a stranger who, came into her home in the evening and assaulted her. And then she later identified this man, his name was Donald Thompson. She identified him and said that was him. But he had the most perfect alibi you can imagine, because at the time of the assault, he was actually on television, on live television, and he was actually testifying about eyewitness memory errors, and he was on the television at the same time as the superintendent of police. So like he was like he had literally the superintendent of police was his alibi. So like you couldn't have asked for for a better alibi. So like I was like, well, how did this happen? And of course, what happened was that the woman, when she was being assaulted, she, as you might do, turned away and the television was playing, and she stared at the TV. And she saw, that Donald Thompson was on television. And then later, as our memories often do, she transposed his face onto the face of the person who had assaulted her. So her memory had correctly deduced and inferred the source of his face was that evening, and it was at that correct time, but she had put it on the wrong person. And
Yeah, I mean,
so that's a very dramatic example, but we all do this kind of thing all the time where we see a face and you can't quite place it, and then you kind of mentally stick it on a body, but sometimes it's the wrong body.
I mean, that story highlights a couple things. I mean, one of which is the relationship between attention and memory,
Yes.
right? Because attention is the point where the data is kind of being, collected and put into that RAM, right, for later storage. And you highlight how stress, right? Stress is just one of the things that affects our attention, causes us to narrow our attention. And so people talk about how stress might cause your memory to be better, and other folks talk about how stressful experiences might make your memory worse. How does the immediate environment of laying the memory down affect the accuracy of the memory?
Yeah, so in quite a few ways, actually. So the first thing is, yes, absolutely. Attention is crucial in memory. And a lot of the time when people say, oh, I have a bad memory because I can't remember something, actually, it's not about their memory at all. It's that they just never encoded that information in the first place. So how could you possibly remember it? And in fact, sometimes people will say, well, keep trying, you'll remember it. And people will dredge something up. But actually, a lot of the time, that's not a real memory. They've constructed it. It's not real because they never encoded it. So they don't have it at all. And yet, then there are a lot of things that will affect that sort of attentional process of, you can think of attention as being like a spotlight, or even like sometimes like a zoom lens, okay, that it can be really wide and it can be taking in lots of information, or it can narrow in really, really tightly, okay. And we do this consciously and unconsciously all the time. Sometimes your attention is very broad. You're taking in lots of, you're going for a walk. So you're taking in all the scenery around you. Maybe you're listening to a podcast at the same time. There's lots of bits of information coming in. But then maybe something happens on the podcast and your attention zooms right in on that. And now you're not noticing the dog walking by you. You're just listening really closely to what someone is saying. So we can narrow our attention in. It's easier to use this as a visual metaphor, but it occurs across all our senses. We can narrow this zoom lens in really tight, or we can broaden it out. And sometimes that happens without our conscious attention. And one of the things that can make that happen is stress. So there's some really nice experimental work on this where, for example, my favorite experiment, and that's like from 1988, but it's just a really nice and neat experiment where they brought people in and they told them they were going to get like an inoculation. So, they're kind of giving them an injection. And of course, a lot of people are afraid of needles. But interestingly, of course, not everyone is. Some people are more afraid than others. So the people's stress levels are going to vary depending on how much they find this a stressful situation. And they brought them in under some ruse. And then they said, okay, we're going to give you the inoculation. And they measured their blood pressure before and after they got the inoculation in order to see whose blood pressure basically shot up when they were after getting this. And that they were saying, okay, those are people that we're thinking of are kind of high reactive. They're people who have this reaction to needles. They're having a stress reaction to it. And then they gave them a surprise test. They said, okay, now we want you to pick the nurse who gave you the shot out of the lineup. Okay, so they didn't know they were going to have to do this. And what they found was that the people who had that really high stress reaction were really poor, like only at chance level at identifying the face of the nurse, where people who were kind of at that lower stress level were, were kind of at normal levels, which is, we're only ever so with identifying faces. But, they were at normal levels, whereas for people who got really, really stressed, that really came down. And that's essentially because when that stressful event happens, their attention zooms in this case, probably zooms in on the needle, on the stressful thing, the pain, the whatever it is, and they're not encoding that other information about the face. So they're literally just not recording it in the first place. It's not laid down. So they're not able then to recall it later on. And that's just a really nice, neat experiment. But there's lots of subsequent work showing kind of similar effects.
Yeah, and I think another point that comes up in that story is how what might seem like uncertain at one point becomes more and more certain as we sort of, revisit the story. And it seems like the examples of flashbulb memory, Space Shuttle Challenger, that's the one I'm familiar with. I'm old enough to remember that one, Space Shuttle Challenger. But that the memories become sort of solidified after some point in time, like 1 year.
After about a year, actually, is what the data shows. So it was a really good study where William Hurst and his colleagues, they followed people up for 10 years after 9/11. And they asked them, so in this study, firstly, they managed to, they got people to, within a few days of the 9/11 events happening. They had stands out around campuses and they were recruiting people and asking them about their memories of the event. So they were asking them about different things like factual information, things like, how many planes were there, and then also kind of personal stuff like, where were you when you heard this? Who was the first person you spoke to? How did you feel about it? And then they followed them up for 10 years. Now, obviously, they didn't follow up everybody, but they followed up a pretty large sample of them for 10 years. And what was really interesting is what they found is that, so if you're looking at people's memory for information, like how many planes there were, okay, you have a correct answer to that question. So you can just score that as being accurate. when it comes to like where were you and who were you talking to, I can't tell you that you weren't actually on the street, you were actually in the living room. I can't tell you that. But what I can do is I can assess your consistency in your responses. So do you say the same thing every time? And what they found was that the consistency of people's responses would dip quite sharply, over the kind of say the course of the first year after the event, and then it would stabilize and it would stay at this very stable level thereafter. So for the last 9 years, people are telling the same story, and essentially what's kind of happening here is they're not really remembering the event; they're remembering the story they tell about the event. We all have the story that we tell about these kind of big, like whether it's your own personal event or whether it's a big national or international event. Um, and what was really interesting was when they looked at the factual information, like how many planes there were and, all that kind of thing. People's, confidence dipped over time. They're like, I don't really remember all those details that well anymore. I couldn't tell you, how many attackers there were. And, I knew all that stuff when it was on the news and I've forgotten it now. But when it came to the personal memories, those kind of flashbulb memories that feel so vivid that it's like taking a photograph, people's confidence stayed up really high, like about 9 out of 10 over the course of the entire time, even as their consistency dipped down quite low. So our confidence in those memories doesn't really match our actual accuracy or consistency in them. I've got my own story about this as well. It's in the book.
Yeah, no, your story was great because as I was reading it, I was like, wait, she must really have a late breakfast, right?
I'm glad you picked up on it. But so the story on for this is for 9/11, I was 18 and I was in Rome with my best friend. It was our first, adult trip away, without grown-ups. And on the morning of September 11th, we came downstairs into our hostel. We were staying in the youth hostel. And there was a TV hanging up on the wall, and everybody was standing around looking at the TV. And we said, what's going on? And they said a plane flew into the World Trade Center in New York. And we were all going, oh God, what happened? And everybody was talking about, oh, I think it was a little plane. No, it was a big plane. Oh, I think, do you think he had a heart attack? What happened? And then as we watched the second plane hit, I remember it so vividly. It is so clear. I can picture all of it. I know what I was wearing. I can see all of it like a photograph. But as you picked up, and as some of your listeners might have picked up, I can't possibly have had this experience in the morning because there's a 6-hour time difference between Rome and New York. So it had to have been 3 o'clock in the afternoon because the attacks happened at 9 a.m. New York time. But for many years, I was convinced that this is how it had happened. And then I was actually giving a lecture at a conference on flashbulb memories. And I was giving here's my example of a flashbulb memory. And literally, as I was writing the talk, I realized that this was wrong, which I know sounds like it's a story I'm making up, but it actually it's true.
So even memory researchers have problems, right?
Yeah. I mean, nobody's immune to these things. And I mean, honestly, there's this general thing as well. It's not just memory researchers, it's everyone. There's this phenomenon, it's called the third person effect. Whereas if you describe any kind of cognitive bias or any kind of thing that a lot of people are prone to, people will listen and go, yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a thing that happens to other people. Not me,
Right.
other people.
Right.
So, we think other people are prone to confirmation bias, but we are not. We're very logical,
Right.
And everybody, when they hear these kind of stories about memory, they tend to think, oh yeah, that happens to other people. They don't really tend to think about it happening to them, that they're us being as susceptible as what we all are. It is a fundamental part of how memory works. It's inescapable. Like the reconstruction of memory is literally the basis of how memory works. It's inescapable. You can't just have a good memory and not have a reconstruction. Even those people who have that HSAM condition that I talked about earlier on, those like incredibly accurate memories. So like these are people who, can tell you like what the weather was like on the third Tuesday in July in 1997, But even those people, even though their memory for their own lives are really, really accurate, they're just as susceptible to distortion as anyone else. So
well, maybe we can talk about some environmental factors that influence one's encoding and recall. And so, you talk about schemas, and schemas are frameworks for understanding the world. And so we're more likely to encode memories that are in alignment with those schemas. But it seems like, everything we know about the dopamine system suggests that we should be paying more attention to things that sort of violate the schema. So how do those things work together?
So actually, both of those things are true to an extent. So if you take some of the kind of the early classic work on schemas, where you look at you'll say Okay, here's a nice, it was a nice example of an early experiment where they had the participants would walk into a room, and it was a room that was set up as a researcher's office. Okay, and they would walk in and they'd spend a few minutes looking around the room, and then they'd come out later on and they'd ask them, what do you remember seeing in the room? Okay, and they would all remember like kind of the classic things that you would expect to see in a room that were there. So they would remember, the table and the chair and the typewriter, all of that kind of stuff. They also recognized this. They also remembered things that were really unusual. So there was like a skull on a shelf in the room. So almost everybody remembered the skull because it was so unusual that it stood out. So it kind of was something that was like, that's really strange. I noticed it. It's unusual. It's odd. But what was also interesting was that about 2/3 of the participants remembered seeing books in the room, but there actually weren't any books in the room. But our schema for what an office is like includes books. So when they came out later on and they described what was in the room, they remembered books. So you can see that happening in both ways, that we're reconstructing this memory in a way that conforms with our schema. But if there were things that stood out as being particularly unusual, those will also be things that we will remember.
So not only does what we bring to the experience shape our memory of the experience, but also stuff that we learn after the experience, right?
Absolutely. So
And so when you learned that this thing,
information.
you saw these news events where this thing happened in the morning, and that
Yeah.
kind of infected your memory, right?
Yeah, exactly. So like the more when these things are so prevalent in the news, it's a very, very strong effect. So like, I knew the 9/11 attacks happened at 9 a.m. and that, I took that brick essentially and slotted that into my Lego tower. But incorporating post-event misinformation, which is the term that we use into memory, is so common. And so again, it's the kind of thing that's often talked about in this way, this very negative way of like, that's memory errors. And that's because a lot of that work originated in a forensic context. So in the
Yeah.
context of, say, the judicial system and eyewitnesses. So let's say, for example, you are a witness to a car crash. Okay. And then you see a car kind of go through the traffic light and hit another car. And then the police officer comes over and asks you about what happened. And they say to you something like, so, how fast was the car going when it sped through the red light?
I love this
Okay.
example.
Yeah. So there's two things that happen there, right? There's two pieces of information. The first is that he asked you how fast it was going when it sped through. So he's telling you that it went fast. And the second thing is he said it was a red light. Now, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but maybe you didn't recollect that it was a red light. So there's a good chance later on that when you remember this, you're going to remember the car was going fast and that it went fast through a red light. Okay. Now, a lot of the time, of course, when we talk about this in that context, we're saying, right, this is an error. This is changing your memory of the event, and that's fundamentally flawed and fundamentally bad. But actually, if we think about why that ability would have come about, is that a lot of the time it is more accurate to rely on multiple sources for information than just your own memory. So, if you have, in an experimental setting, we're setting this so that the information I'm giving you is incorrect, so that I know for a fact that it's incorrect. But in reality, what will often happen is what we'll have is co-witnesses. So you'll have multiple people who all witness the crash, and they're all talking to each other about what happened. And now one of those people might have something that's incorrect and they might infect the other people's memories. But what we see is on the whole, what tends to happen is that when multiple people talk about the event, you get a sort of wisdom of the crowd that their overall accuracy is higher than the accuracy of the individuals on their own. Okay, so we're taking all of the bits of information. Someone remembered what color the traffic light was. Someone else remembered, there was rust on the bumper at the back of the car. Someone else remembered that the driver was bald. Whatever it might be, we're incorporating those details into our own memories to create a more accurate memory and a more accurate reflection of what really happened. Sometimes there is a flip side that sometimes that can result in a mistaken memory, and of course the research that began all this, particularly Elizabeth Loftus's work, is really, really and influential in showing how that can have really negative consequences in a legal setting. If a witness misremembers what happened in a crime, and then, for example, somebody is mistakenly convicted of a crime they didn't convict because somebody misremembers it was the wrong person, or that they went through a red light when actually it was a green light. So,
Yeah.
but I think what we're trying to do here is to just kind of slightly redress the balance, to send the pendulum a little bit back, but not all the way back the other way. That we're not saying every memory error is wonderful and we should embrace it, but we are saying we should recognize that these these changes to our memory, these distortions to our memory often serve a purpose.
Now, this has got to be related to the source amnesia thing, right? So if you are um, adjusting your beliefs about the world, about what happened by incorporating the insight of others, I mean, presumably you could do that without it affecting your own memory of the situation, right? You could keep a clear boundary and say, well, okay, this is what I remember, but this is what I learned from all these other folks. And it seems like maybe my memory is faulty, but that's not sort of how you would encode this. You would just sort of
Well,
blend it
sometimes
all
it is,
together,
yeah.
right?
Well, I suppose say like we don't encode these things usually with a tag, with a source, like we
Yeah.
invert the source. But there actually is a lot of research on this and whether people are able to kind of remember these layers, of like, so like there's lots and lots of work on exactly this, on source memory. So are you able to remember the source where you got the information from? And are you able, so there's some really nice work, for example, saying, well, what if we have not just, not the classic misinformation work, it's one piece of misinformation. You saw a green light and I tell you it was red. But what, like, there's a lot of work now saying, well, like, what if there's two pieces of information that actually conflict with each other? Then what happens? So there's a lot of work on how we actually try and do this, and it's quite complicated when you get into it. And a lot of it does again come down to attention. It comes down to there's a huge difference between, say, the way you're going to be influenced by that post-event misinformation about the traffic light is going to be very different depending on whether you initially encoded, I saw a green light, or whether you didn't encode that at all. So if there was a gap in your memory, and then you're inserting the bit that's the brick that says red light, or am I actually changing the content of your memory? Those are two different things. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment, like very kind of cutting edge work right now, trying to figure out a lot of that stuff. We're actually running a study, an EEG study at the moment, trying to look at actually what happens in the brain when we do that, when we encounter conflicting information. So, we'll see what comes up that. But yeah, no, so it's like, it's not as straightforward as that we just silo the information and that we just have, that we just pull it out from different buckets and say, this is the information I got from source A and this is the information I got from source B. It does tend to be more of a soup. But we tend to we are still, we're not disasters. Like, we can navigate the world generally quite well, so we do manage this task.
Yeah, and I was interested in the impact of age on these effects. So it seems like source amnesia is more pronounced as you get older. I certainly, that's true with me. I mean, I remember when I was in grad school, every single claim I would make would have half a dozen footnotes attached. And now I just sort of forget. In fact, it's going to be terrible, but in a couple of years, I'll be like, oh, I had this wonderful podcast on memory. And I'll forget, who you were and everything else. Hopefully not, but
I won't take it personally.
Right. But that's sort of an age thing. And you also talk about how the schemas kind of become more rigid as one gets older, right? And as one's fluid intelligence.
Our schemas become more developed with age, and they become more, yeah. So in general, broadly speaking, our minds are more flexible when we're younger. So like we are at the peak of our cognitive abilities, and our kind of sort of our early 20s kind of is around the peak of most of those cognitive abilities, those kind of fluid intelligence abilities and working memory, all of that. But there are also kind of other things that we kind of get better at. Like, for example, like people, like sometimes people, like in some ways, say people are more susceptible to misinformation as they get older, but people also tend to have more knowledge and more experience as they get older. So they're better able to distinguish between kind of content that is sensible versus not sensible, things like that. But there are a lot of kind of influences of age on memory broadly. Not all negative, So I mean, and it's fun because every time I give a talk about memory, usually almost the first question I get asked is about aging, and it's usually somebody who's concerned about their own memory. And that's, of course, I don't want to diminish that. I mean, I've had family members who've had dementia. Like, I don't want to diminish that at all. But I do think it's also a thing that as people get older, they also become very attuned to this, and they're paying an awful lot of attention to their own memory abilities because they have this concern. And then they will detect kind of flaws in their memory and interpret this as indicating that there's, some significant difficulties with their memory, when actually, like, these are things that we all suffer from all the time. But if you're younger, you're not reading into it to the same extent.
Yeah, but it does seem like this is a bit of an evolutionary mismatch, right? Because in the presumably in our ancestors' times, not only did we live less long, but we also had a world that was changing much less quickly. And so it would seem like this fluid intelligence, which is critical and early in life to figure out how to navigate the world. I mean, we probably would like to extend that later in life simply because we can't coast on what we learned in our 20s anymore, right? You know, we want to have, we would love to, if we could redesign human beings from scratch, presumably we would want to extend that fluid intelligence window, wouldn't we?
Well, yeah, sure, of course you would, but sadly that's not in our gift. But yeah, look, I mean, there's a lot of things that we might like to do differently, and in general, like, you know, some like the best advice for, you know, for kind of good cognitive health and aging is the same as for everything else, and it's kind of boring. It's, you know, eat well, get enough sleep, don't smoke, keep cognitively active, get plenty of exercise. You know, it's like there's no one weird trick, you know. And actually there are a lot of, you know, companies and things that will try and sell you brain training, things that actually they don't work. The evidence shows they don't work. What they're very good at is training you to do that one task, but it doesn't generalize to anything beyond that task. So, you know, like, don't waste your money on those. But, you know, so like it is, you know, it's kind of thing where like you want people to say like, oh, there's this one thing you can do, like do Sudoku every day, and that'll do it. That'll do it for you. And it's like, no, don't smoke. You know, get exercise, get 8 hours sleep.
Yeah.
Those
So,
are
I mean, some people like to talk about memory like a muscle, right? So if you exercise it and use it, then it will get stronger, right?
so.
Is there any,
So I mean, I think the thing is, I think when we talk about these things, it is important to remember that the memory isn't just one thing. There are lots of different functions that all come under the umbrella of memory, and some of those we can train, and some of them we can't. So, like working memory, for example, is something that we can train. So, like working memory is that, you know, short-term memory, that ability to kind of hold a small amount of information in your memory and then perform operations on it. So, you know, like say things like if I read out a list of digits to you and then I tell you to reverse them or mentally multiply them or anything like that, that's working memory. And it only lasts for, you know, maybe max, maybe 30 seconds. Okay. You can train that. You can train the capacity of your working memory so that you can, and this actually works very well. And you can train this so that you can hold more items in working memory and you can do more things while you're holding them and, you know, increase that capacity. But that's not going to improve your ability to, you know, remember to go to the post office or, you know, remember where you left your keys. They're different tasks. And so when I say that, like those things, when I say they don't work and they don't generalize, you can train that one individual function, but it doesn't generalize to broader functions.
so is there any evidence that technology is impacting our memory? And I know, you know, people have been complaining about the impact of technology ever since Socrates, right? But we all know, I mean, I can't navigate my way to the restroom without, you know, Google Maps. I mean, what do we know about the impact? Are we just sort of outsourcing our memory?
To some extent we are, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is what we do all the time. Our minds are flexible and we make use of whatever is available to us. So what you're talking about here is there is some evidence of these things, right? So there's a couple of particular effects. So one of them is, like you said, with say like Google Maps, or, you know, using a sat nav. If you use a sat nav to drive, you know, to some place you've never been to before, you want to go across town to some place you've never been, and you use a sat nav to get there, as we all do, the chances are if I later on give you a test and say, can you tell me exactly how to get there again? You're not going to be able to remember it as well as if you had figured it out by yourself. Okay. But that doesn't mean that you have lost the ability to navigate. You just kind of, you know, you just kind of offloaded that particular task to your phone or your sat nav instead. Similarly, if you are taking a lot of photographs, your memory of the events that you're taking the photographs of will be reduced. Okay, it's called the photo impairment effect. So, like, this is, I always think of, actually, I also think of that when you see people, you know, at a concert and you know,
Yeah.
they have their phones up and they're filming the whole thing, and you're like, you paid €125 plus Ticketmaster fee to be here, you know, and you're watching the whole thing through a 3-inch screen. Like, this is, you know, and you're never going to watch that video again. You're not. And you're not going to remember that as well as if you just put the phone away and actually experienced it and were there taking it in. Because when you know that something else is doing it, you don't need to. But we don't need to have this fear that means technology is ruining our mind. This is exactly the same way as if somebody says, you know, like you say, you're going to the supermarket, and instead of remembering your shopping list, you write it down. Okay. You don't then also need to remember it. Like our brains are flexible. Like they're not just running on tracks, they're able to adapt. So like if you say, I have written down my shopping list, you've essentially told your brain, you no longer need to remember this.
Yeah.
You don't need to remember bread and eggs and mouthwash. It's not necessary. It's not a good use of your resources because you've offloaded that task. That doesn't mean that your ability to go to the shop tomorrow and remember that you need to buy, laundry detergent is going to be impaired because you wrote it down yesterday. It's just that if you could think of it as being almost like extending your mind. Okay.
Yeah.
It's almost like adding an external hard drive to your computer. You're just giving yourself a little bit more, like a broader sketch pad to play with. And that sometimes we use those tools. There's nothing wrong with using those tools, but we should do them consciously. We should be aware of where they are interacting with our cognition, not in the sense of like, ruining our brains, but in the sense of, I'm not going to remember this event if I spend so much time behind the camera instead of actually experiencing it.
So look, I mean, if our memory is not built for accuracy and we have distortions that go into the encoding and the recall, and we're vulnerable to implanted memories and so forth, getting back to this forensic question, why is it that we still put so much weight on eyewitness testimony? I mean, do you think that the court system will adapt and evolve in a way that reflects modern research on memory?
Well, it has already. There has been a lot. Now, obviously, there's no one court system. There's different jurisdictions all operate differently. But broadly speaking, most judicial systems have taken into account quite a lot of the evidence since, say, the 1970s, when a lot of this work started coming out. And there has been a lot of changes in the way that what's important a lot of the time isn't, by the time you get to court, like this is often maybe 2 years, several years after an event has happened. By that point, that's kind of less important. What really matters is about how evidence is gathered in the first place. And there have been a lot of changes that have been put into place in a lot of jurisdictions based on evidence from eyewitness research and so on about what happens when the evidence is gathered. So there are things like there have been changes to like lineups, how lineups have to happen. So ways to make sure that just even like really basic things like you need to have like at least the number varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but somewhere between 6 and 10 decoys in the lineup. They have to look similar to the other person. They have to have the same characteristics. You can't just have you're one guy with a face tattoo and nobody else has a face tattoo, because then somebody is going to identify them based on that feature. We have loads of evidence on this, for example, about cross-race identification, that people are generally pretty good at identifying faces within their own racial and ethnic groups, but we're much poorer at doing it across groups. And that applies to everybody. It's across all groups. So generally, on the whole, we tend to have a lot more experience with faces that are of our own racial and ethnic group. So when we look at, if I look at other faces that like are the same ethnic background to me, I tend to identify those faces by individual features. Whereas when we tend to look at faces from other racial categories, we tend to see group level characteristics rather than individual level characteristics. So we'll talk about things like, the shape of the eyes or the shape of the lips that are group level rather than being specific to that one person. So then if you have a lineup and that contains just a couple of people who are of that particular ethnicity, then you're going to identify somebody based on those group level characteristics. You're going to say, well, that's the person who had the same shape eyes, or that's the person who had the same size lips, or the same shade of skin, or whatever it might be. Okay, but it's got nothing to do with that actual individual. It's a group level feature. So recognizing that has meant that there are now much stricter rules about similarity across decoys, and that like lineups having to be good quality, and an identification can be challenged in court if the lineup wasn't of good quality. There's also a lot more guidance about how to extract evidence in an interview and how to do it properly. Now, that is not to say that every case does this well. Like there are very, very good guidelines and very good training available for police officers on how to do good forensic interviewing, how to extract unbiased information, how to extract information without unduly influencing a witness or unintentionally influencing them. But people can still choose to avoid those rules and do it in kind of subtle ways. There's really nice work showing sometimes even just non-verbal cues can have these kinds of effects. Like For example, and I'm on video now, so this will work for video people and not for audio people. But if I was to say to you something like, and was he wearing any jewelry? And here I'm pointing to my
Yeah.
wrist. You're much more likely to say watch. Where if I said, was he wearing any jewelry? And I'm pointing to my finger, you're more likely to say, yeah, he was wearing a ring. But on a recording, it will just say, and was he wearing any jewelry? Which is
Yeah.
an open question. But that non-verbal cue of somebody pointing at their wrist or their finger will kind of give a hint to the witness on what it is that you think they should be saying. Like that person thinks he must have been wearing a ring, for example. So, there are kind of lots of things like that. So yeah, courts, investigators, they're becoming much more aware of these things, but I certainly wouldn't say that things are perfect. One of the things that is important a lot of the time is having expert witnesses to educate the jury about the nature of eyewitness memory and eyewitness testimony. But there are still a lot of judges who don't like that, who don't think it's necessary. And we think that, there's this idea of like whether or not a witness is credible is really up to the jury to determine. But the decision there seems, when you talk about credibility, it seems to be whether or not you think this person is lying to you. Whereas what a memory expert would say is they can be being totally honest and they can still be incorrect. So you
Now,
just kind of trying to recognize that.
Now, to be clear, I mean, I've heard this claim made many times about, intergroup accuracy, right? But really, it's not about the similarity between yourself and the people you're observing. It's the similarity between the people you're used to observing.
Exactly. It's
And the people
familiarity
you're
with your
observing.
own group. So
Right.
it's
Well,
about,
yes. So for instance, if you were, say, African and adopted into a white household with a white neighborhood, then presumably you'd be better able to recognize white
exactly.
faces.
And
right?
there's loads of evidence showing exactly that. So it's not some kind of like genetic memory that like I have some inborn ability to identify Irish people and discriminate between blue and green eyes. It's not anything like that. It's literally learned familiarity. So yes, if you're are raised in an environment or are adopted into an environment where people are on the whole of a different racial background to you, then you will have much more familiarity with that. It's about your experience, particularly when you're young, the experience you have growing up, and the number of faces within that group that you're exposed to. That you're just constantly exposed to. I grew up in like a suburb in Dublin. I was constantly exposed to white Irish faces. I've seen more of them than you could shake a stick at. Whereas, say, my exposure growing up to faces of people of African or Asian origin was less than my exposure to white faces. So my expertise in white faces and white Irish faces is higher. So I'm more likely then, when I see these faces that I'm an expert in, I'm more likely to identify individual level differences and to identify people based on their individual characteristics rather than to identify them based on being a member of a group.
Now, there have been some fads, right? I think the recovered and repressed memory fad has been pretty well studied. But it seems like even though that whole fad has been more or less refuted within the scientific and legal community, there still seems to be a popular conception that we have these encoded memories that are somewhere in our body, right? But not in our minds.
Is the term
so I mean, first of all, why is that such a popular notion, and what does it capture, and is there any merit to it?
So why is it popular? I think people want kind of an intuitive way to talk about trauma, and they want an intuitive way to talk about how their past experiences have affected them. And of course, our past experiences do affect us. And quite naturally, people want a way to think about that and to talk about that and to understand their own experiences. And one way that often happens is this notion of traumatic memories being sort of locked away in the body, and that there's some kind of, they're kind of like leaking poison, like being sort of like locked behind in a room behind a door, and then the poison is leaking out under the door. And that poison is somehow infecting our lives and is giving us, is changing our behavior or our relationships with other people in adulthood, or, and that all, kind of feels kind of sensible and feels kind of intuitively like it ought to be true. The problem is that there is no actual mechanism of memory that actually works that way. And it's not how memory works. That's actually it's a very Freudian idea. It's based on Freud's idea of kind of memory repression, and this idea of kind of repressing things, and that it bubbles up to the surface. But it's not held in any repute by memory scientists now. So obviously, it's people's past experiences do affect them and do have lots of kind of psychological consequences. But where we would kind of want to sort of draw that line is to say that there is no evidence that memory repression exists. What does exist is forgetting. We all forget all the time. But there is a difference between forgetting, which is a totally normal process, and we can forget even very traumatic things, even things that are very dramatic. We can have forgotten something for many, many years and then be reminded of it. But that's not the same thing as this sort of subconscious repressing mechanism that gets talked about. And so that's, in some ways that kind of might seem like an academic distinction, but the reason that this is important is because of the discussion that often happens that kind of goes in hand with that memory repression, is this idea of recovered memories, that somebody can help you to kind of dredge up a memory that you had repressed, and that you can recover this memory. And these memories, when they're talked about, are typically these very traumatic memories. And the problem with that is that there is often a little bit of evidence that a lot of those recovered memories are false memories, that they're not real, but they feel real. And they feel just as real. And I think it's really important that when we talk about these things, that we recognize that, recovering a traumatic memory, even if it's not real, is still distressing to the individual. They still have that experience that this thing happened to them. They feel like it happened, but a lot of the time the evidence is that it didn't. And so sometimes, in the literature on this, there's really dramatic examples of people, so you probably heard of the Satanic Panic. So there was this period of history where there was this great concern that there were the kind of satanic cults that were engaging in this ritualistic behavior that included the ritual sexual abuse of children, and a variety of kind of very kind of grisly kind of behaviors. And there was a big rash of these kind of recovered memories of people having been subjected to ritual abuse. And then, like, the most famous case probably a lot of people have heard of is the McMartin trial, where in the end there were 500 accusations of sexual assault at a daycare in California. And they included, things that actually were said in court, things that about teachers flying through the air and the children being forced to drink blood and being taken to like a farm via helicopter, and all this stuff happening in underground rooms in the school. There were no underground rooms. They actually excavated under the entire school. Like, there were no underground rooms. There was all this incredibly elaborate stuff that literally could not have happened. But a lot of this came about through this very, very suggestive questioning of very vulnerable, very young children. So, some of that is, and like, you tell these stories and it's kind of like they're very dramatic, but a lot of the time for normal people, the events that they're remembering are a lot less dramatic than that. But they can still, when we really try to use these very suggestive methods to try and encourage people to remember these repressed memories, a lot of the time what they're going to construct is a memory that feels plausible, but that isn't necessarily true.
Have they ever done any follow-up studies on those children that were coached or had the memories implanted? Have they looked at them 20 years later?
Those children, I don't think, not that I'm aware of. I don't think there were any with those children, but there have been, on like kind of case studies following up with people who have recovered memories and then discovered that they were discovered for them, I suppose, that they weren't true. And there's often talk about it being still very distressing, but they still have this memory. They have a memory of something happening that is now in conflict with evidence that it couldn't have happened. So, but that doesn't make the memory go away. It doesn't remove the pain that comes with that. So they have to be very careful. And a lot of the time, particularly during the kind of the 80s and 90s, when the recovered memories thing was at its height, a lot of those memories were recovered in therapy using extremely suggestive methods, so often using hypnosis, which we know by definition, and the purpose of hypnosis is that it makes you suggestible. It puts you into this mental state that makes you very suggestible. Sometimes with people were given drugs, like things like sodium amytal, that makes you very suggestible. It's kind of drugs that sometimes what we call truth serum. They don't elicit truth. What they do is make you kind of confabulate. They make you talk, and they make you very suggestible to and make you quite compliant. So if you get people into these very suggestible situations, or even just without drugs, without hypnosis, just in a setting where you have, somebody who completely trusts the therapist, and the therapist in many of these cases now, these are small, that's obviously not the majority of therapists at all, but some of them they would be going into these therapy sessions working on the assumption that something had happened. So then the questions they're asking are very leading questions that are leading to this idea that, so in the case of, say, the children,
confirmation bias, right? They're not
and they're kind of implanting. It's kind of misinformation. They're implanting it, and like in the case of, say, the McMartin trial, I mean, you can read the transcripts. It's egregious the way they questioned the children. Like they would ask them like things like, did this thing happen? And the child would say no, and then they would say, well, think about that again. Are you sure? Are you really sure? Because everybody else came in and told us about it. Why don't you imagine what it would have been like if that happened, and tell us about that? And there was no real attempt to distinguish between the imagination and the truth. So, and those things you can result in really like implanting a very traumatic memory in a young child in that case, or in an adult of something that happened as a child. And I think it's very important that we speak about these things sensitively. And I also think it's very, very important whenever we talk about this stuff. I'm always very conscious whenever we talk about these, like false memories of childhood sexual abuse, that this could be taken to suggest that we're saying, that you shouldn't believe people who come forward with historical claims. And that is absolutely not at all our position. The vast, vast majority of people who come forward with claims of child sexual abuse or historical abuse, these are things that actually happened. These are things that people have always known happened to them. They might not have thought about it for a long time, but it's something they always knew that happened. They might have reinterpreted it now. And this is often something that happens. You think about something from when you were a child and you go, God, at the time I thought that was okay, and now I know it wasn't. Or, people have many reasons not to come forward. Shame or fear, lots of reasons not to come forward. So it's very important that we recognize that the vast, vast majority of people who come forward with claims of child sex abuse are, they're talking about things that really happened and they should be believed. But we are talking about this very small subset of these recovered memories, of these recovered repressed memories. And in that case, where these people are saying, I had repressed this, had never any idea that ever happened. And now over the course of therapy, I have recovered this memory of this very dramatic thing that happened. In those cases, there's often reason to think memories aren't true.
Well, you also talk about how if you have sort of a negative affect or valence later about an event that happened earlier, you're going to remember it as having been more negative in terms of its experience, and also
memory
positive,
is very
right?
associative. Memory works by associations. So our memory is very associative generally, and the way we tend to kind of remember things, it tends to be when something will trigger a memory. And sometimes that can be you're walking down the street and you see a shop and it suddenly reminds you of something you haven't thought about in years, or you smell something and it brings you back to childhood. But sometimes that can also be emotion. So our emotions are linked in a kind of neural network as well, and they're linked with our memories. So if you're in a particular emotional state, or you're thinking about something that has a particular emotional valence, that's likely to trigger other memories that have a similar emotional valence. And one of the consequences of that can be, like we see it in, for example, people who have a kind of severe depression. That you'll often, if you know anybody who's going through a period of depression, you might notice that they're very, very negative, and that they tend to you can only think about negative things, and they only remember negative events. And that is something that happens when you're in that very negative state of mind, that very negative emotional valence, that can you will be more likely to retrieve more negative memories. And then that can lead, when we're building our schema then of, what my life is like, what my relationships have been like, because you're more likely to activate these more negative memories, your schema will kind of give you the impression that your life has been very negative and that your experiences have all been very negative. And I can make no claim on whether somebody's life or experiences actually have been positive or negative, but certainly you're more likely to have a sort of more glass half empty approach to remembering your past experiences, and you'll find it more difficult to bring positive experiences to mind.
Well, look, you said somewhere in the book that this is not a self-help book, and I took that at face value. But unfortunately, I always have the tendency to interpret everything as a self-help book,
Okay.
and so while I think your claim that narrow focus versus broad focus, one is not better than the other. Remembering and forgetting, one is not better than the other. I mean, could we at least say that being more conscious of how our memory works is desirable, and perhaps we can, hone that awareness, being aware of schemas, being aware of how they shape our experience, being aware of stereotypes, being aware of source amnesia, just having some metacognition around how this process works and being more intentional about it. Could that be something we should
and that is
pursue?
one of our main messages, that we think, that we should have a bit more kind of more grace for ourselves and for others about our memories, to not have an expectation that our memories should operate perfectly either for ourselves or for others, that not to judge people because their memories are flawed, and equally not to judge yourself because you don't remember everything with perfect fidelity. You shouldn't expect that of yourself. That's you're not a video camera. And it's, when we talk about this, it makes it sound like you're less than a video camera, but you're more than that. You actually have the ability to reinterpret and consider your past experiences in this really flexible way, and that's actually incredibly valuable. A video camera can't do that. A video camera can't explain to you what your experiences mean, but that's what our memories do. They help us reinterpret and understand what our experiences mean and how we should act on them. So I think, if we can try and recognize that in ourselves, and recognize, that our memories have evolved to help us, flaws and all, you know, and that, I think will. And then, we're actually working on an intervention for, we didn't talk about this here, but we have a whole line of work looking at, misinformation and fake news, and that kind of disinformation environment. And what intervention that we're working on is to get people to recognize the extent to which we tend to be more susceptible to misinformation that aligns with our pre-existing views about the world. And what we find in that is that just telling people that, they kind of go, oh, yeah, sure, okay. But if you make them experience it for themselves, that actually it's really quite effective at reducing that bias going forward. Because we have, again, that sort of third person effect I talked about earlier. If I tell you about it, you go, that's a thing that happens to people. But if you experience it yourself, it's more powerful. So recognizing that not just are other people vulnerable to these things, but you are too. And that's okay. Just be aware of it and don't expect yourself or anyone else to be perfect.
Well, Ciara, thanks so much for joining me. The book is called Memory Lane. It's a book about memory. It's also a self-help book. Right? So thanks so much for joining me.
Shelved in the wrong place in the bookshelf.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.